been to Argyll many times.
I mean, I've been to Argyll probably hundreds of times in my life. I've been to Oban lots of times. In fact, one of the best holidays I ever spent took in Oban. I think it was in, must have been 1994 or something like that. I went up the east coast of Scotland, across the top, and down the west coast and across the Skye. So Oban was a part of that, and I love the west coast. I think it is in a country that has not got a shortage of stunning places and really wonderful places. I think West Coast really is up there amongst the best, and I think there's so much about Oban in particular that does cast it in a national sphere. We've just been down at the cinema watching the video, and seafood capital of Scotland. The food and drink here is such an iconic part of what Oban and the West Coast and Argyll in general has to offer. Obviously there are challenges, connectivity being at the top of the list, both digital connectivity and transport connectivity, but we're investing a lot of money to try to improve all of that. So I think there's every reason for Oban and for Argyll generally to feel really optimistic about the future, and it's really good to get the chance today to see some different elements of it.
I think there are some frustrations in Oban particularly around the amount of investment that the Scottish Government has promised to the area, but the time it takes for the local authority to deliver it. I think there are some frustrations around that, because you've funded a TIF project here, which tax incremental funding project, and other areas have had similar amounts of money and they've already delivered. So there's frustrations around that and I think in listening to people that they would suggest that's about the large geography of Argyll and Bute, and that there's some boundary changes going on at the moment. Is there better ways to do government, do you think?
Well, the boundary changes that are proposed are not to the boundaries of Argyll and Bute. They're about the boundaries of the different wards within Argyll and Bute. I mean, I think there is a question, as there will be periodically in any country, about are the structures and the boundaries we've got in place for governance and administration the right ones. And I think it's it's right periodically that we have a look at that. We're a country of 5 million people. We want to make sure that those are right. But I think I've always felt, when I was health secretary, periodically we would have debates about the boundaries of health boards. What's more important is exactly what you say. It's what we do with the resources we've got. Now, in the period we've been in government, we've had a very difficult climate in terms of public funding, so we've had to deal with significant cuts to public funding. But against that backdrop, we've tried to prioritise the things that matter most, and housing, transport, digital, where we're investing large sums of money. RET is one example that it has made a difference to the Western Isles. It will make a difference here as well. So we're trying to focus money where we think it can make the biggest difference to areas. Yes, in many of the things we invest in, we require to have partnerships with local authorities, housing associations, health boards. Tax incremental financing is a new form of financing projects. So this is not the only area where there have been teething problems in getting these programmes off the ground. But I've just been to visit a new housing project,
fantastic, isn't it?
Which is wonderful, which is a collaboration between government with significant government funding in there, and the housing association. So there's also evidence of where
there's also a fantastic project going on in Iona as well, where you're building houses, and that community haven't had houses for 50 years.
Exactly.
So there's real differences being made, and I suppose people don't join them together, do they? Sometimes, and
it's interesting. People are impatient, understandably. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, and people are right to be impatient to see progress in their communities, and often the length of time it takes to get things done frustrates me. I always want to see things done quicker. But I think we've also got to celebrate the progress that has been made, as I say, against a backdrop of really tough public finances. So things like broadband are hugely important. Broadband today, having access to good quality high-speed broadband, we should see it as fundamental as having electricity when you turn a switch, and we're investing significant sums of money in the superfast broadband programme, and that will get broadband to the majority of premises across Scotland. But there are going to be areas where it doesn't reach, just because of the remoteness of these areas, which is why what we were announcing this morning, to make sure that we're getting different innovative ways of getting it to,
which has
to the
happened
areas that are harder to reach.
with Mull and Ling and Jura and these places that have joined up and thought of a different project. And I think that says a lot about the resilience of people here. Whilst there might not be a lot of funding, people go on and do things and want to support a wider picture.
Well, that's where I think rural and island communities have got so much to teach the rest of Scotland, because of the resilience, because of often having to find solutions to things because of the particular circumstances. There's a lot more innovation and imagination and just a real sense of just getting the job done. And I think sometimes, as somebody who lives in and represents an urban constituency, we take a lot for granted. But in rural communities you just can't take for granted. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that sense of resilience and finding different ways to do things.
It took Stella 3 days to go to the hospital about a broken foot because she thought it would just be fine, and that's the sort of thing. Folk are very cautious about what they use. And what
I remember, it's not this year, but a couple of years ago, it's probably more than that now actually, when down in the Kintyre Peninsula there was the terrible snow.
That must
be in March actually. So it was February, March. So it was when it was not expected, and the area was Campbelltown. It was cut off for days on end, and going down there and just hearing, because I went to visit just after the worst of it had passed, and I wasn't able to get in before then, and just hearing how they'd coped and the ways they'd found to make sure people weren't getting forgotten about, that people were getting food delivered to them.
It's amazing.
It's just, and as I say, from somebody who lives in a city, you think, see if that had happened to us, we wouldn't have had a clue.
There's lots of resilience plans because of that.
Exactly. So there's a lot. I know the challenges of living in remote and island communities are not insignificant, but the resilience and the imagination and the creativity that is put into finding ways of dealing with things, as I say, I think we could all learn an awful lot from.
Absolutely. Emma, do you want to talk about health?
Yeah, I mean, mine's is a bit more specific. It's just obviously the Belford Hospital, we need a new one, and everybody knows that. And that's what the issue is. The funding's supposed to be coming in around about 2019, 2020. But what people in NHS Highland and Lochavullin District Partnership have noticed now is now that Tesco have pulled out of the site they were meant to be building in Fort William, this site would be perfect for a new hospital. So what they're trying to do is now they're trying to see if there's any way that the funding can be brought forward. So I just want to know the practicalities of that.
The government is keen to, there is a potential site available. I think there are one or two issues around it that I won't go into, but I think everybody thinks that it is a potentially good site. The NHS is at an early stage of putting together the business plan. Okay. So basically, for the government to make decisions about funding and approval, we need to have the business plan, and that will take its course. But I think there is a willingness and a desire on the part of the government, just as there is locally, to see the Belford rebuilt on a good site and fit for purpose accommodation as quickly as possible. So I can't give guarantees, I can't give specific timescales at the moment, but there will be a willingness to work with the health boards locally to make sure that the opportunity of a good potential site isn't lost.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the site would be perfect. It's right in between. It's right in between the health centre and the police and ambulance.
No, I'm aware of it. I think, there is support from the government in trying to examine the potential for purchase of that site.
On the back of that, Nicola, and if you don't want to answer that, this is fine, but on dialysis, you were quite involved when we started a dialysis campaign in Argyll, and the place is now in Campbelltown, which is fantastic. I think people would like that rolled out further, for instance, have somewhere here in Oban. What are possibilities around that?
Well, again, these are all down to proposals being made, health boards being able to stack up. With any clinical service, you have to have a certain critical mass in order to make it safe and sustainable. But when I was health secretary, I was a big supporter of getting as many services delivered as locally as possible. And dialysis is a case in point where, this is obvious, but I remember Skye.
Oh, bless him, I miss
who needed dialysis. We all miss Skye. But I remember just sitting with him one day, and him talking to me about what a day of dialysis meant for him. And it literally meant a 24-hour, and he had to do it 2 or 3 times a week.
2 to 3 times a week.
And so the travelling, then the actual dialysis, the recovery time, the travelling back again. And so if you can provide a service particularly like that more locally, you actually, it's no exaggeration to say, you start to give people their life back.
You do.
Because they've still got to have the dialysis, but you take away much of what goes around it for them. So I think that's really important. I'm not sure, I'm happy to share, but I'm not sure what the position is, whether there's proposals for...
We've been running a campaign in the newspaper.
Right.
And...
I can't, I'm not the kind of politician that sits and makes promises.
No, I know you're not, absolutely not.
But I will, later on today, be with the Health Secretary who's here for the Cabinet, so I will raise this, I'll tell her you mentioned the campaign to me, and I'll ask her to look into it and see if there's more or anything we can do to help bring people around the table.
It's about that resilience locally, that there is money, there's a possibility of doing it, but it's how you build it into a framework that...
The principle is one we support, of local access to care. If you've got an offer of funding support, then that's clearly something you would want to try and realise. So I'll ask Shona to have a look at it, speak to the health board locally, and see if we can nudge people to get them around the table, at least to make sure it's properly being explored.
That'd be great. Good. Now, anything else you want to tell the lovely readers of the Oban Times?
What else I want to tell? Other than that, I really love Oban. I wish I was here
Come
for more
back.
I wish I was here for more than one day.
I'll give you free tickets to the cinema.
Listen,
but you need to buy your own popcorn.
If I lived in Oban, I would spend a lot of time in that cinema. But sitting there watching the film, I don't know if you've seen the film they've done.
That was the first time.
That's the first airing it's had. I was starving. Lovely seafood and beef and whiskey and chocolate.
I know, it made it look great. About the tender process that's going on, it gets folk riled up, doesn't it? That
of course it does, because ferry services are lifeline services to people who live in island communities, or who have to get to island communities. So not only do I understand the passion that it arouses, I actually think it's a good thing that it arouses so much passion. We're legally obliged to put the service out to tender, and that's a conclusion we've reached on the basis of painstaking sort of scrutiny of the issue. If we weren't legally obliged to do it, we wouldn't be doing it. And that process has to take its course. But the one thing, well, a couple of things I'd say: the service is not being privatised. It will remain a public ferry service, a public contract. This is just a question of who delivers, who operates that public service contract, and the terms and conditions of the workers, the fare structures, the timetables, all of that remains under the kind of general governance of the Scottish Government. So these are really important things. The second thing I would say is we're investing heavily in ferry services, and you mentioned road equivalent tariff. A wee while ago. That's been great for the Western Isles. I'm sure it's going to be great when it comes in. It's October it comes into force here. So we're investing considerable amounts to make sure we've got really high quality ferry services, because it's, we talked about broadband earlier on being fundamental to the ability of communities to survive. Ferries are the same for many of the communities around Argyll and the islands, so we totally understand the importance of it. The very nature of the service means that occasionally weather will disrupt ferry services, and that's part of
I think people understand
it. And
that.
I think people are generally very understanding. Perhaps less.
It's always an opportunity.
Absolutely. But we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure these services are as high quality and as reliable as possible.
There is I don't know if you know about this, but there is a ferry group on Mull who want to run their own ferry as well alongside the service. But yeah, it's interesting, and that's about people's resilience again, isn't it?
Absolutely,
like, what can we do? What can we do here? So